Sign it. The word didn't echo. It landed, heavy, final, like it owned the room. Richard Whitmore didn't look up as he pushed the contract across the 12-foot glass table, the polished surface reflecting rows of tailored suits, gold cufflinks, and quiet power. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched in steel and sunlight, but inside, everything felt colder, tighter, controlled. A pen hovered in the air, waiting for his signature. Around him, executives leaned forward just enough to show interest, not enough to show doubt. No one questioned Richard Whitmore. No one ever did. Behind him, almost invisible, Naomi Carter moved along the edge of the room, a soft cloth in her hand, wiping fingerprints from the glass no one else noticed. Her steps were silent against the marble floor, her presence smaller than the shadows cast by the chairs. She kept her head slightly lowered, not out of fear, but out of habit. People like her were not meant to interrupt moments like this. People like her were meant to pass through them, unseen. The air smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the quiet hum of the building's climate system filling the gaps between breaths. Richard adjusted his cuff, eyes scanning the final page. Multi-billion-dollar deal. Someone murmured from the far end, voice edged with admiration. Another voice followed, lighter, almost amused. All it takes is one signature. A faint ripple of agreement moved through the room. Naomi reached the end of the table, her cloth pausing just for a second as her eyes lifted, not toward the men, not toward the skyline, but toward the document itself. Lines of text, numbers, clauses layered beneath language designed to look simple. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. Then she spoke. Not loud, not forceful, just enough to exist. Then you'll be signing it to the wrong owner. The room didn't react all at once. It slowed first. A blink. A breath held half a second too long. Then silence pressed in from every corner, thick and immediate. The pen above the paper stopped moving. Someone let out a quiet scoff, sharp enough to cut the tension. Richard didn't turn. His lips curved into something that almost looked like a smile, but not quite. Did the maid just try to think? A few soft chuckles followed, carefully measured, as if even laughter needed permission in this room. Naomi didn't move. The cloth remained in her hand, resting against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, steady, unshaken, present. Page 14, she said, her voice still even, almost calm enough to disappear if you weren't listening closely. Liability transfer. Subsection C. The chuckles faded, not because they wanted to, but because something in her tone didn't match the role they had already assigned to her. Richard's eyes shifted down, just slightly. Not enough to admit curiosity, just enough to check. His fingers flipped the page. The sound of paper sliding across paper echoed louder than it should have. One of the executives leaned in, adjusting his glasses. Another straightened in his chair. The room changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that everyone felt it without understanding why. Richard's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. You think you understand this deal? He asked, still not looking at her. Naomi finally lifted her head fully. Her gaze didn't challenge him. It didn't need to. I know who owns it. The words didn't rise. They settled. Another pause followed, longer this time, stretching thin across the table like tension you could touch. Richard's hand hovered above the document again, but this time, it didn't feel steady. Say it, he said, the confidence still there, but quieter now, like something adjusting under pressure. Naomi took a single step back from the table, giving the space back to them, even as she held something none of them could see yet. Evelyn Carter. The name moved through the room like a shift in gravity. Chairs creaked softly as people adjusted without realizing it. Eyes moved, not to Richard, but to each other, searching, calculating, remembering. Richard's head turned now, slowly, finally, his eyes locking onto Naomi for the first time. That's not possible, he said, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something thinner, something that didn't sit as firmly in his voice. Naomi didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step closer. She simply stood there, the cloth still in her hand, the glass table between them reflecting both of their faces, one controlled, one calm. Then don't sign it, she said quietly. The pen in Richard's hand hovered again, but this time, it wasn't a symbol of authority. It was hesitation. And for the first time in that room, silence didn't belong to him. The pen did not move. It stayed suspended above the paper, just a fraction of an inch, but that fraction stretched into something heavier than the entire deal. Richard Whitmore stared at the name on page 14, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something safer, something familiar. Evelyn Carter. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, steady, indifferent, while a bead of condensation slid down the side of a crystal water glass and left a thin trail on the polished table. No one reached for it. No one moved at all. Across the table, a senior partner cleared his throat, but the sound came out too quiet, swallowed before it could settle. That entity is sealed, he said carefully, choosing each word as if it might be examined later. No public filings. No direct trace. Another executive leaned forward, tapping a tablet, fingers moving faster now, pulling records, cross-checking, searching for something to disprove what had just been said. The faint glow from the screen reflected in his glasses, flickering like uncertainty. Richard's jaw tightened again, but this time it held. "Who told you that name?" he asked, finally turning fully toward Naomi. His voice was lower now, not sharp, not dismissive, but measured in a way that suggested calculation rather than control. Naomi did not step closer. She did not retreat either. She stood where she was, between the wall and the edge of the table, a place designed for people who were meant to pass through, not stand still. "No one told me," she said. Her hands were still, the cloth now folded neatly in her fingers, no longer moving across the glass. "Then how?" Someone muttered, almost to himself. A soft tapping sound filled the silence as another device connected to the network, pulling deeper records, private databases. Internal archives. Lines of data began to populate screens one by one. The room, once filled with quiet confidence, now carried the low, almost imperceptible energy of people trying to catch up to something they had missed. Richard flipped back to the signature page, then forward again, slower this time, reading each line not as a formality, but as a risk. "This clause," he said, more to the room than to Naomi, "is standard. It is written to look standard," Naomi replied, her voice steady, unhurried. "But it transfers full liability if the ownership structure is not disclosed." Another pause, this one sharper. A legal advisor leaned in, scanning the same section, his finger tracing the paragraph Naomi had pointed out. His posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough. "She is not wrong," he said quietly. The words did not echo, but they landed harder than anything before them. A chair creaked as someone leaned back, exhaling slowly. The weight in the room shifted again, not toward panic, not yet, but away from certainty. Richard's grip on the pen loosened just enough for it to rotate slightly between his fingers. The skyline outside remained unchanged, bright and distant, but inside, the glass walls felt closer. "Even if that is true," Richard said, regaining a fraction of his composure, "you still have not explained how you know the owner." Naomi's gaze did not waver. It did not challenge him. It simply remained present, as if the answer had always been there, waiting for someone to ask the right question. "Because she taught me what to look for," Naomi said. A faint shift moved through the room again, quieter this time, more internal than external. Someone stopped typing. Another set a tablet down slowly, as if the information it held was no longer enough. Richard studied her now, not as an interruption, not as a mistake, but as something he could not immediately categorize. "You are telling me," he said, each word deliberate, "that you understand a multi-billion-dollar acquisition structure better than the team that built it." Naomi did not smile. She did not hesitate. "I am telling you that the person who built that structure did not want you to see it." Clearly, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It carried weight, implication, consequence. A legal pad lay open near the center of the table, untouched, its blank page reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror. Richard's eyes flicked once more to the name. Evelyn Carter. The same name that had shifted the room seconds earlier now seemed to hold something deeper, something unfinished. "And who is she to you?" he asked, quieter now, the question no longer about the deal, but about her. Naomi inhaled slowly, the first visible sign that the moment had reached something beyond calculation. The hum of the building, the distant noise of traffic 30 floors below, the faint clink of glass settling against glass, all of it pressed into the space between them. She is the reason I am here, Naomi said. Not louder, not softer, just clear. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one in the room moved to interrupt her. The words settled into the room, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy enough to shift something deeper than the deal itself. Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Naomi, but they were no longer searching for an error. They were measuring, recalculating, adjusting to a presence he had dismissed only minutes ago. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint hum of electronics and the distant echo of the city below, 30 floors down, where everything still moved as if nothing had changed. But inside this room, something had. A senior analyst finally broke, his voice quieter than before, stripped of certainty. Evelyn Carter. She disappeared from active filings almost 10 years ago. His fingers hovered over his tablet, scrolling through archived documents, pulling fragments of a financial ghost. No interviews, no public statements, just holdings. Quiet, strategic holdings. Another voice joined, more cautious now. And whoever controls those holdings controls this deal. The implication hung in the air, unfinished but understood. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than before. He placed the pen down on the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, but deliberately, as if acknowledging that the moment had moved beyond a simple signature. The soft click of metal against glass echoed louder than expected. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, but the space around her no longer treated her as invisible. Eyes that had once dismissed her now tracked her every movement, not with respect yet, but with attention. It was a beginning. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creasing under the shift of weight. "You said she taught you," he repeated, his tone quieter, more precise, as if each word needed to be chosen carefully now. Naomi nodded once, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to confirm. When he asked, Naomi's gaze drifted for a brief second, not away, but inward, as if reaching into something older than the room itself. Before she stopped being seen, she said. The phrasing lingered. It was not what they expected. Not a date, not a timeline, but something else entirely. A legal advisor frowned slightly, trying to translate meaning into structure. "That is not an answer," he said, though his voice lacked the authority it carried earlier. Naomi did not argue. "It is the only one that matters," she replied. Another pause. This one quieter, but more grounded. The kind that does not break easily. Richard's fingers tapped once against the armrest, a subtle, controlled motion, but enough to reveal that something beneath his calm had shifted. "If she is the owner," he said slowly, "then why is she not here?" Naomi looked at him fully now, her expression unchanged, but something in her eyes held a weight that did not belong to this room. "Because she does not need to be," she answered. The response was simple, but it unsettled the room more than any technical explanation could have. A few executives exchanged glances, the kind that did not require words, only shared understanding that control was no longer where they assumed it was. One of them leaned forward again, this time not to challenge, but to verify. "We can request confirmation," he said, already reaching for his phone. "Direct contact, legal validation, you will not get it," Naomi said, gently, but firmly enough to stop him mid-motion. His hand paused above the table, uncertain. "Why not?" he asked. Naomi's voice did not change. "Because she already gave it." The room tightened again, not in confusion, but in anticipation. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus. "To who?" he asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. The delay was not hesitation. It was timing. She stepped forward, just one step, closing a small distance that suddenly felt significant. The glass table reflected her movement, doubling it, making it impossible to ignore. "To the person she trusted to speak when it mattered," Naomi said. The words settled differently this time. Not as information, as position. The realization did not hit all at once. It moved slowly, from one face to another, from one mind to the next, until it reached the center of the room where Richard sat. His posture did not change, but something behind his eyes did. The certainty that had defined him minutes ago was no longer solid. It had cracks now, fine but undeniable. "You are saying," he began, choosing his words with more care than ever before, "that you represent her." Naomi did not rush to confirm. She let the silence hold for a second longer, long enough for the weight of the possibility to settle fully. Then she nodded once. I am saying she made sure I would not be ignored when it mattered most. The room did not respond with laughter this time. It did not respond at all. And in that silence, something irreversible had already begun. The silence did not break. It settled deeper, heavier, like something that had finally found its place. Richard Whitmore did not move for a moment, his gaze fixed on Naomi Carter, but not with disbelief anymore. This was different now. This was calculation meeting something it could not easily control. Around the table, the executives no longer leaned forward with confidence. They sat back, some with hands folded, others with fingers still resting on devices that no longer felt useful. Information was no longer the problem. Understanding was. Richard reached for the contract again, but this time his hand did not rush. He turned the pages slowly, each line now carrying weight it did not have before. If what you are saying is true, he said, his voice quieter, more deliberate, then this entire structure was designed to filter out anyone who was not paying attention. Naomi did not answer immediately. She watched him, not with defiance, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that felt grounded in something older than the moment. Not anyone, she said. Only those who assumed they did not need to look twice. The words landed without force, but they carried precision. A legal advisor shifted in his seat, clearing his throat again, but this time the sound carried hesitation. We need verification, he said, though the urgency in his voice had softened into something closer to caution. We cannot proceed based on a claim without documentation. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward him, then back to Richard. You already have it, she said. The advisor frowned, flipping through his notes, scanning attachments, references, anything that might confirm what she meant. There is nothing here that names her directly, he insisted. Naomi stepped closer to the table, her hand no longer holding the cloth, now resting lightly against the edge of the glass. Her reflection aligned with the contract between them. That is the point, she said. Richard's fingers paused on a page, then moved back again, slower, more careful. His eyes narrowed slightly as he reread a section he had passed over earlier. The room leaned into his silence, waiting. A faint shift in his posture signaled it first. Not dramatic. Just enough. The holding company, he said under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. Layered ownership. Indirect control. He looked up, not at Naomi, but at the room, as if confirming something none of them had seen before. She does not need to be named if everything points back to her. No one spoke. No one disagreed. The realization moved through the room slowly, like light finding its way into a space that had always been closed. Naomi did not smile. She did not react at all. She simply stood there, allowing the truth to settle without pushing it forward. Richard leaned back again, this time not as a gesture of control, but as a need to create space between himself and the document. His hand moved away from the pen completely. You knew this before you walked in here, he said, his eyes returning to Naomi, sharper now, but not dismissive. Naomi nodded once. Then why wait until now, he asked. The question carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Naomi's gaze did not waver. Because this is the moment where it matters, she said. A faint breath moved through the room, almost synchronized, as if everyone had been holding it without realizing. One of the executives shifted, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier confidence. If she controls the deal, then she controls the outcome, he said. Another voice followed, quieter still. Which means we never had full leverage. The words did not create panic. They created clarity. And clarity, in this room, was far more unsettling. Richard's eyes moved once more across the faces around the table, then back to Naomi. For the first time, there was no attempt to diminish her, no trace of dismissal. Only recognition, quiet and undeniable. What does she want, he asked. The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but carrying everything beneath it. Naomi did not answer immediately. The delay was not uncertainty. It was choice. She placed her hand lightly on the table, not claiming space, but acknowledging it. The glass beneath her fingers reflected both her and the man across from her, two figures now sharing the same frame in a way that had not existed before. She wanted to see who would sign without asking. Naomi said finally. The room stilled again. Not frozen this time. just still. Richard's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A shift, subtle but real. "And now," he said, his voice quieter than it had been since the meeting began, "she has her answer." Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then stepped back, returning to the edge of the room, the place she had started. But this time, the space did not swallow her. It held her, and no one in that room could pretend not to see her anymore. No one reached for the contract anymore. It remained at the center of the table, untouched, its pages slightly misaligned from where Richard had turned them, as if even the paper understood that something had shifted beyond correction. The overhead lights reflected off the glass surface, creating sharp lines that cut across the room like quiet divisions, separating what had been assumed from what was now undeniable. Richard Whitmore sat still, his posture composed but no longer rigid. The confidence that once filled the space around him had not disappeared, but it had changed form. It was quieter now, more careful. His fingers rested lightly on the armrest, no longer tapping, no longer signaling control, but holding steady as if recalibrating. Across from him, the executives no longer avoided Naomi Carter. Their eyes moved toward her openly now, not with judgment, not even with curiosity, but with something closer to recognition, though none of them would name it out loud. One of the senior partners leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, almost cautious. "If the ownership is structured the way she described, then any attempt to proceed without full disclosure could invalidate the entire agreement." His words were technical, precise, but beneath them was something else. Concern, not for the deal, but for what it revealed about them. Another executive nodded slowly, adding, "And if she anticipated this moment, then this was never just a transaction." The statement lingered, heavier than expected. Richard's gaze shifted briefly toward the contract again, then away, as if he no longer needed to read it to understand it. "It was a test," he said quietly. No one disagreed. The words settled into the room, filling the spaces that silence had left behind. Naomi stood near the edge of the table again, not reclaiming the center, not asserting position, but present in a way that could no longer be overlooked. Her hands rested at her sides now, still, composed, her posture unchanged, but the room had moved around her. A test of what? Someone asked, though the answer was already forming in their minds. Naomi's eyes moved across the table, briefly meeting each face, not challenging, not accusing, just acknowledging. "Of who would listen," she said. The simplicity of the answer made it heavier. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning forward just enough to rest his forearms on the table. The glass beneath him reflected his expression, but it did not carry the same certainty it had at the start of the meeting. "And we failed," he said, not loudly, not with regret, but with clarity. The admission did not create tension. It released something. A quiet shift moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable. One of the advisors lowered his gaze, another closed his tablet, the faint click echoing softly. There was no need to search for more data now. The truth had already arrived. Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the moment to settle, to exist without interruption. Then she spoke again, her voice steady, grounded. "You did not fail because you did not know," she said. "You failed because you assumed you already did." The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. They carried weight on their own. Richard looked at her, really looked this time, not as a role, not as a disruption, but as a person who had changed the trajectory of the room without raising her voice. "And what happens now?" he asked. The question was no longer about authority. It was about consequence. Naomi stepped forward once more, but only slightly, enough to bridge the distance without claiming control. The light from the windows caught the edge of the table, reflecting upward, illuminating her face in a way that felt unintentional, but precise. "Now," she said, "you decide whether you want to understand or just recover." The distinction settled immediately. Around the table, the executives exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried acknowledgement without needing agreement. Richard remained still for a moment longer, then slowly nodded. Not as a gesture to her, not as a signal to the room, but as something internal, something shifting into place. He reached for the contract again, but this time, he did not lift the pen. He closed the document gently, aligning the pages with care, as if restoring order to something that had been revealed rather than broken. The sound of the paper settling echoed softly, final in a way the earlier command had not been. Naomi stepped back again, returning to the edge of the room, but now the distance did not diminish her presence. It defined it. The glass walls reflected everything. The table, the skyline, the people, but for the first time, they reflected her clearly too. And in that reflection, no one in the room could deny what had just happened or what it meant. The contract rested flat on the glass, aligned, closed, untouched, yet it held more weight now than when it had been open. No one reached for it. No one suggested reopening it. The room did not feel like a place of decisions anymore. It felt like a place of realization. Outside, sunlight moved slightly across the skyline, shifting angles on steel and glass. But inside, time seemed to slow, as if the moment required space to settle properly. Richard Whitmore remained seated, his hands now loosely folded, not in control, not in retreat, but in reflection. His gaze drifted once more to Naomi Carter, standing at the edge of the room, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had always belonged in moments like this, even when no one else believed it. The faint hum of the building continued, steady and indifferent, filling the silence with something constant. One of the executives finally leaned back fully into his chair, the leather sighing under the shift, his eyes no longer fixed on the table, but lowered, thoughtful. Another removed his glasses slowly, pressing them lightly against the bridge of his nose before setting them down beside his tablet. The small, ordinary movements carried a kind of quiet admission. Not spoken, not formal, but real. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, the breath leaving him not as tension, but as recognition. "We built layers to protect ourselves," he said, his voice low, measured, not directed at anyone in particular. "And we stopped seeing what was right in front of us." No one responded immediately. There was no need. The statement did not ask for agreement. It simply existed. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in understanding, as if she had heard that realization before, long before this room, long before this moment. She stepped forward again, not to take space, but to close the distance just enough for her voice to carry without effort. "It is not about what you built," she said. "It is about what you chose to ignore." The words settled gently, but they did not disappear. They remained, present, unavoidable. Richard nodded once, slowly, his eyes lowering briefly to the table before lifting again. The reflection in the glass showed both of them now, side by side, not equal in position, but equal in presence. "And you chose not to ignore it," he said. Naomi did not answer right away. She looked at the contract, then at the room, then back at him. "I was taught not to," she said quietly. A pause followed, but it was not heavy anymore. It was calm, a different kind of silence, one that allowed space instead of filling it. The tension that had once pressed against every corner of the room had eased, replaced by something steadier, something closer to clarity. One of the legal advisors leaned forward again, but this time his posture was not defensive. It was open. "If the ownership is acknowledged," he said carefully, "then the entire negotiation changes." Another executive nodded, adding, "It becomes a conversation, not a control." The distinction was small in words, but large in meaning. Richard listened, not interrupting, not correcting. When they finished, he looked back at Naomi, his expression no longer guarded. "And what would that conversation look like?" he asked. Naomi's eyes held his, steady, grounded. "It would start with listening," she said. The simplicity of it landed deeper than anything technical could have. Richard's gaze did not shift away this time. He held it, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. Then, slowly he stood. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound. The room followed him with their eyes, not because they expected a command, but because something about the moment required attention. He did not move toward the head of the table. He did not reclaim the center. Instead, he walked a few steps along the side, stopping where the light from the windows fell across the floor, creating a clear line between shadow and brightness. He looked back at the table, then at Naomi. "We will not sign today," he said. The statement was simple, but final in a way that felt different from before. No one objected. No one questioned it. The decision did not come from authority. It came from understanding. Naomi inclined her head slightly, not as approval, not as victory, but as recognition of what had just shifted. Richard's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, then moved to the contract once more. And when we do, he added quietly, it will not be because we rushed past something we should have seen. The room remained still, but it was no longer frozen. It breathed. Naomi stepped back again, returning to her place near the wall, but this time, the distance did not separate her from the moment. It defined the space she had changed. The glass walls reflected the city, the table, the people, and in that reflection, there was no longer anyone invisible. And in the quiet that followed, something more powerful than a signature had already taken place. The room did not move when Richard Whitmore spoke. It held still, not out of tension, but out of awareness that something larger than the deal had shifted beneath them. The contract remained closed at the center of the table, untouched, no longer the focal point, but a reminder of what had almost happened. Naomi Carter stood quietly near the wall, her presence no longer defined by distance or role, but by the silence that now made space for her. Richard turned slightly, his gaze moving from the glass table to the skyline beyond it, the city stretching wide under late afternoon light. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke again. Evelyn Carter did not build this to win a deal. His words were measured, deliberate, each one placed carefully. She built it to see who we are when we think no one is watching. The statement settled into the room with a quiet gravity. No one interrupted. No one challenged it. Across the table, one of the senior advisors slowly closed his folder, the soft sound of paper meeting paper echoing gently. Another executive leaned back, his posture no longer guarded, but reflective, as if the weight of the moment required space to process. Richard stepped away from the light and moved closer to the table again, but not to the head of it. He stopped midway, placing his hand lightly on the glass, feeling its cool surface beneath his palm. The reflection beneath him showed a man who looked the same, but was not. We were prepared to sign something we did not fully understand, he said quietly. Not because we lacked the ability, but because we trusted the structure more than the truth. Naomi's eyes followed him, steady, grounded, not seeking recognition, not needing it. She had already done what she came to do. A faint breath moved through the room, almost synchronized, as if everyone had been holding something they could now release. Richard turned back toward her, his gaze direct, no longer distant, no longer dismissive. You said she made sure you would not be ignored, he said. She did not just mean in this room, did she? Naomi did not answer immediately. The pause carried meaning of its own. She stepped forward just enough for the light to catch her face again, the reflection in the glass aligning with his once more. She meant anywhere it mattered, Naomi said. The clarity of it settled deeper than any technical explanation. One of the executives shifted, his voice softer than before. Then this was never about control, he said. Another voice followed, quieter still. It was about accountability. The word lingered. It did not need definition. Richard nodded once, slowly, his eyes lowering briefly to the contract before lifting again. And we almost failed that, he said. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in acknowledgement. Almost, she replied. The distinction mattered. It held space for what had been avoided, for what had changed. Richard's hand moved away from the table, his posture straightening, not in authority, but in clarity. Then we do not proceed until we understand every part of this, he said, his voice steady, not commanding, but resolved. No one objected. No one hesitated. The decision did not need reinforcement. It had already been accepted. Naomi stepped back again, returning to her place near the wall, but this time the distance did not separate her from the outcome. It framed it. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of recognition, of something seen clearly for the first time. Richard looked at her once more, his expression no longer guarded, no longer shaped by assumption. When you leave this room, he said, you will not be invisible again. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not as agreement, not as acceptance, just acknowledgement. The light shifted again across the floor, stretching longer now as the day moved forward. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the change that had taken place inside a single room. But inside, the balance had already turned, and no one there could pretend they had not seen it. The room remained still, but it no longer felt confined. The glass walls that once framed power now reflected something quieter, something earned rather than assumed. Richard Whitmore stood near the table, his posture steady, his presence no longer filling the room by force, but by choice. Across from him, Naomi Carter remained by the wall, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, but the weight around her had shifted. It was no longer the weight of being unseen. It was the weight of being recognized. One of the executives finally stood, slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft sound that did not interrupt the moment, but joined it. He adjusted his jacket, not out of habit, but as if resetting himself to match what had just happened. Another followed, then another, until the room was no longer seated in hierarchy, but standing in awareness. No one spoke at first. The silence carried something new now. Respect, not announced, not performed, but present. Richard turned slightly toward Naomi, his movement unhurried, deliberate. "You said she wanted to see who would listen," he said, his voice lower than before, no longer shaped by command, but by reflection. Naomi nodded once. "And now she knows," he added. Naomi's gaze held steady. "Now you know too," she replied. The distinction settled between them, clear and balanced. Richard inclined his head slightly, not as a gesture of authority, but of acknowledgement. It was small, almost imperceptible, but in a room like this, it carried more weight than any formal statement. One of the legal advisors stepped forward, holding the contract, but not presenting it, not pushing it forward, just holding it carefully, as if it had become something more than paper. "We will need to restructure everything," he said, his voice careful, respectful. "With transparency." The word lingered, heavier now that it had meaning behind it. Richard nodded. "Then we start over," he said. "Not restart. Not redo. Start over." The difference was subtle, but intentional. Naomi watched him for a moment longer, then stepped away from the table, turning slightly toward the door. The movement was quiet, unannounced, but it shifted the room again. For a brief second, it seemed as if someone might stop her, might ask her to stay, to explain more, to continue what she had started. But no one did, because they understood. Her role in this moment was complete. She had not come to lead the room. She had come to reveal it. As she walked, her steps were soft against the marble floor, steady, unhurried. The light from the windows stretched across her path, catching the edge of her silhouette, reflecting it across the glass walls behind her. No one looked away. Not this time. Richard watched her reach the door, his expression calm, but thoughtful, as if something inside him was still catching up to what had already changed. "Naomi," he said, not loudly, just enough to reach her. She paused, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, but she did not turn immediately. The room held its breath again, not from tension, but from anticipation. Slowly, she looked back. Richard met her gaze, not from across the table now, but from the same level, the same space. "When this is done," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I would like to hear more about how you see what others miss." The offer was simple, but it carried something deeper than opportunity. It carried recognition of perspective, a value that had been overlooked for too long. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. Not agreement, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. "Then make sure you are ready to listen," she said quietly. The words settled gently, but they did not fade. They remained, present, grounding the moment in something real. Richard nodded once more, slower this time, as if the meaning had reached him fully. Naomi turned back to the door and opened it, the soft click of the handle echoing lightly in the room. As she stepped through, the hallway beyond carried a different kind of light, less controlled, more open. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality, not shutting her out, but sealing what had just happened inside. The room remained still for a moment longer. Then, slowly, the executives began to move, not rushing, not speaking loudly, but shifting into something new. Not the same rhythm as before, not the same assumptions. The contract remained on the table, unchanged in form, but transformed in meaning. And for the first time since the meeting began, the room did not feel like a place where power was held. It felt like a place where it had been questioned, and in that questioning, something more honest had taken its place. The door closed with a soft, measured sound, and for a moment, no one in the room moved. The echo of it lingered longer than expected, not loud, but final, like a line drawn without force. Richard Whitmore remained standing where he was, his gaze fixed on the door Naomi Carter had just passed through, as if something of the moment still stood there, just beyond reach. The glass walls reflected the empty space she had left behind, but it did not feel empty. It felt marked. Around the table, the executives shifted slowly, not returning to their previous positions, but adjusting to something they had not prepared for. The contract remained untouched at the center, its edges aligned, its surface still, but its presence heavier than before. One of the advisors stepped closer to it, then stopped, his hand hovering just above the paper before lowering again. He did not pick it up. He simply looked at it, as if seeing it for the first time. Richard exhaled quietly, the breath steady, controlled, but carrying something deeper than tension. He turned back toward the table, his steps measured, not reclaiming the head position, but moving alongside it, his hand brushing lightly across the glass surface as he passed. The coolness of it seemed to ground him. "We almost signed something we did not earn," he said, his voice low, not directed, but heard by everyone. No one responded immediately. The statement did not require agreement. It already had it. A senior partner nodded slowly, his eyes still on the contract. "And we almost proved her right," he added. The words settled without resistance. Richard stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the document, then at the reflection beneath it. For a brief moment, his own image stared back at him, unchanged in form, but altered in meaning. He reached out and placed his palm flat on the contract, not to claim it, not to move it, but to acknowledge it. Then he lifted his hand away. "We start again," he said, quieter now, but clearer than before. Across the room, one of the executives straightened, adjusting his stance, not out of habit, but as if aligning himself with the decision. Another gathered his notes, not to leave, but to begin again with intention. The room shifted, not into motion, but into purpose. No urgency, no rush, just direction. Richard turned once more toward the door, his gaze lingering for a second longer than necessary. "She said to be ready to listen," he murmured, almost to himself. A faint reflection of Naomi's silhouette still lingered in the glass, stretched by the angle of the light, faint but present. He held that image for a moment, then nodded once, slowly, as if committing to something beyond the room. The city outside continued without pause, sunlight now lower, casting longer shadows across the buildings, the light softer, less direct. Inside, the brightness had changed too, not dimmer, but deeper, as if the room itself had shifted its perspective. One of the advisors finally picked up the contract, but not to proceed. He opened it carefully, turning back to the same page, the same clause, his finger tracing the lines again, slower now, reading not just for accuracy, but for understanding. Others leaned in, not to assert, but to see. Richard watched